Hello and welcome to this lecture on philosophy of religion. This is the material we covered on class on Friday the 15th. I'll go over it pretty quickly here. So the topic for today is what is philosophy? And I'm starting with definitions students submitted. The first one is quite a literal definition of philosophy. Philosophia is the love of wisdom. That's a good definition as far as it goes. It's also, however, etymological. That is to say, it's just the definition of the word. It doesn't really tell you what philosophy is, what activities are engaged in this pursuit, in this love of wisdom. Part of the point of the definition is a kind of humility. Rather than saying we're sophists and that we are wise, we're those who love wisdom. We're in a relationship with wisdom. We're trying to get acquainted. So there's a certain humility in that definition. Philosophers, even if they're arrogant, find some refuge in that sort of ploy. So there are other definitions here. You can look at it. I'll make a mention of the last one there. Philosophy is the study of the history of what philosophers have learned and believed and researched. It's understandable to think that's what philosophy is, especially if you've attended philosophy classes. This is what you find you do. You look at what philosophers have said in the past. But to understand philosophy as acquiring knowledge about what others have said in the past is underselling philosophy. That limits philosophy too much. Philosophy in this class, and at all times really, takes place even now. It's not just something that happened in the past. So it's how you react to the textbook, how you react to the other writings in the class, how you interact with other students. All these are ways of doing philosophy, aspects of doing philosophy. This present dimension of doing philosophy is very important, and we must not forget it. These next definitions, also from students, are okay as far as they go. I want to point out that they are too general. They may be accurate to some degree, but there are things that you can do that satisfy these definitions that aren't yet philosophy. The study of questions. A linguist might study question, or someone in the history of ideas. And again, history of ideas, not quite the same thing as philosophy. And I'll have you look over the others. But an analysis of how true an idea is. Certainly there's lots of disciplines, mathematics, psychology, all kinds of areas where you have analysis of how true an idea, a critical analysis of what's going. That's very common. So yes, certainly philosophy does that, but that's not all that it does. The last definition there, I think this one the student took from the textbook. Something like that is what the textbook says. So we'll come to it in its proper time. I'll just point out that it's probably pretty general too. Critical thinking is important in many disciplines, not just in philosophy. Although, nevertheless, critical thinking is an introduction to philosophy. Critical thinking courses are introductions to philosophy courses. Here we have more student definitions that are both too general and also, curiously, at the same time, too specific. Just pick one, the study of religion and existence. Philosophy certainly studies religion and existence, but it's not the only thing that studies religion. Sociology studies religion, psychology studies religion, and existence as well. It's both too broad. Psychology and sociology satisfy that definition. It's also too specific because philosophy doesn't just look at religion. It doesn't just look at human existence or our existence. It's got a lot of topics that it looks like. The next one, philosophy is the study of logic. Same thing. That's another subject within philosophy, no doubt. But it's not the whole of philosophy by any stretch of the imagination. So this is too narrow. But to study the existence or the reasons for existence is not necessarily the only thing that philosophy does, or something that philosophy does exclusively. I'll mention that this last definition here is, I believe, the first one to mention argue, although I don't know, I put them in different orders. So an argument is a big part of philosophy and what you'll be doing in certain of the exercises for sure. So these are some student definitions that are a little bit more accurate. Again, the first one is somewhat traditional. It may have been taken from another course. The textbook even includes something like this. Go into that a little bit more in the next slide. But these definitions, I'll just have you look over them. These are a little bit more comprehensive and yet specific to philosophy. Traditionally, philosophy is divided into these three branches. Axiology is a bit of a problematic name, perhaps, for it. It means value theory, but some people think that's too narrow of a way to look at what this third area that has to do with. Epistemology is all about knowledge, based on the Greek word for knowledge, the highest kind of knowledge. What makes for knowledge, for human knowledge? What's the justification of it? So ideas about belief and argument and logic fit into here. Metaphysics is about the nature of reality, the nature and scope of reality. Anything that's real, time, space, social status, political power, political authority. When you look at philosophy with this slightly more specific, threefold, and kind of traditional way of looking at things, you notice how great the overlap is with religion and religious concerns. And in fact, if you look at where this comes up in the textbook, you'll see that they're really talking about religion at this point. The next topic is the relationship of philosophy to religion. And so the first way of looking at it will be to look at religion as philosophy. People who are religious doing certain kinds of philosophy that serve that religion. Now, within the Western context, we have these: natural theology and apologetics. So natural theology concerns nature and the relationship of nature to God. Basically, the idea of understanding the nature or existence of God from what is evident, which is that nature exists. We're put into the world, a natural world on earth, and if you look at it, you can wonder, certainly, and wonder where it's all from and what it's all about. So the question about how natural reality is related to transcendent reality, the created, how it's related to the creator, to use language that is squarely theological. These are certainly questions that have been asked and gone into in lots of detail, both in ancient times. You can think of the first cause argument as an old argument, but also more recently, even ecological dependencies, the way evolution has enfolded so many forms of life in niches, which are just other forms of life, and these intricate forms of dependency that transform. Although evolution is sometimes taken to be inconsistent with God, before Darwin, the whole line of argument usually went the other way, from the nature of nature, as it were, to the existence of God. Today, there's actually a newer version of this where we're trying to take account not just the external natural world, but indeed experiences that humans have. If those can be called natural too, in some sense, then natural theology needs to account and may want to try to argue for the existence of God from natural occurring experiences, religious experiences. Apologetics is the logical defense or refutation of specific religious propositions. So this is critical thinking applied within religion. You might be trying to refute heresies, but you're not trying to refute religion per se. You're trying to also defend religion and maybe doing either. So this is religion as philosophy. But philosophy of religion is far broader than that. It's not just from within one religious perspective, but it is very often about the justification or refutation, confutation of religious beliefs, but also more neutrally about the clarification, to clarify and understand exactly what a belief is, what its implications are. So this philosophy might try to do without any pre-existing theological or religious agenda, if they can get away with avoiding one. This is the definition of philosophy of religion the textbook gives, and you can see it's pretty much in line with that, and it's more or less a philosophical, not necessarily religious apologetics. So philosophy applied to religion, as the textbook understands it, is focused on the question of religious beliefs if they're meaningful at all, that's a more critical perspective, or if they can be shown to be true or probable in some sense, likely to be true or somehow approvable in some way. Also, can they be clarified, which, when you think about it, means we can have beliefs we're not very clear about. So our deepest beliefs, you think they'd be closest to our heart, but in fact, they're often the hardest to articulate. Or rather, they're frustrating to articulate, because when you articulate it, it just comes out, Mom and apple pie, have integrity, it's important to be nice. And generalities like that, which no one can dispute or would bother to, because there are always countervailing generalities, and there's a balance of interest and conflicts that we have to deal with all the time. So priorities, beliefs about priorities, and priorities of beliefs is certainly a big question that philosophers take up, and it comes up in the question of religion. So you can think of philosophy as doing its thing with regard to many different disciplines, religion also. But we might look at science and see how it really works, maybe try to help it out a little bit, clarify some of its beliefs. Or it could look at these other disciplines or areas and try to question and clarify, justify, and confute our various different beliefs. Also, the relation to action is tremendously important, both in religion and philosophy, and beliefs are thought to motivate action in some way. There's questions of not just single beliefs, but systems of beliefs, and there other logical criteria like consistency come into play. Should your belief systems be logically consistent? Many religious belief systems are not really, and don't even try to be, but frankly, so are most, in fact, all cultural systems. The only systems that are really attempt to be logically consistent in a rigorous way are philosophical systems, mathematical, scientific thought. There's a big question about whether logical consistency is just a big bugaboo when it comes to religious belief and religious experience. This has to do with whether philosophy is meddling in somebody else's turf or meddling where it doesn't belong, bringing in these criteria of logical consistencies and coherence and so on. Are those universal and you can demand of any person, of any reasonable person, or is that some special philosophical prerogative? I'll leave you to decide that. Also, one of the ways to think about beliefs is that they possess explanatory power. Like, given other beliefs that you have, namely what the facts are around here, and other things that you may believe, then acquiring a given belief or not may make the difference between whether something is explained to you or not. So philosophy is in the business of explanation, but what the hell that is also hard to say and a moving target. You can say it's making things plain, making things clear, but that can happen in story form or in formal hypothesis. So I might make things, so let me tell you a story and try to make things plain that way. The story doesn't refer to anything you're talking about. It's about a little rabbit or something like that. But, it clicks and you get the picture somehow. So if it's just explanation, the question, there are many kinds of explanation, many ways to make things clear. Explanation also, if you think about it, always presumes some given fact that needs to be explained. It provokes wonder and needs to be explained. Some mystery, for lack of a better word. In religious and spiritual matters, the word mystery is very appropriate, but the general term, explanandum, the thing that needs to be explained. And then there's, of course, the working end of the explanation. That is a bunch of words. So there's some fact, or experience perhaps, or some existence in the world, and we say, hey, how did that come about? We're not clear about that. We need to get clear about it. We need some kind of explanation. And then some other thing needs to be said. Someone comes along and scratches where it itches with their mouth, with their lips. They talk, they say something. And then we say, now I get it. Okay, so in an explanation, there's the thing to be explained and what is the explanation. So the main course of philosophy is to go through, and you'll do this in your essays probably, is to go through a sequence of potential explanations and say why they're all wrong, except maybe the last one, where you say that's the best one. And 2 or 3 is enough for a long paper. So I want now to talk about chapter 2, which is about this very question of the relation of philosophy and religion. Chapter 2 starts by quoting Daniel Dennett, famous, very well-known philosopher, quite a good philosopher really, but against religious doctrines and tends to be quite dismissive of religion. Actually, I heard him say, you can see him on YouTube somewhere, saying that he rather likes going to church and singing along and that sort of thing, but the belief system is just like not for him. And there are others too. Richard Dawkins is also mentioned. He's of special note because that book from 1976 called The Selfish Gene is the locus classicus of the concept of the meme. A meme is a word or an idea that, like a gene, can replicate itself, can multiply copies of itself, and has a chance of surviving and keeping being replicated or not. Some memes die out, and the ones that keep getting replicated get reproduced. So it's a unit of cultural evolution. So he's tried to take a biological evolution, and like many other people have, and extended it in a unique and important way, which has been widely taken up, trying to understand cultural change as a form of evolution by meme. He's got other books. You can see his attitude very clearly. You can find him all over on the internet. The God Delusion and Outgrowing God is a very recent one, which I have not looked at. But just to give you some idea of what the textbook calls religious non-realists, but that's an unfortunate term. They're really anti-religious philosophers, is what they are. And Christopher Hitchens, with books like God is Not Great and Is Christianity Good for the World? The answer is no. And Sam Harris, The End of Faith, which sees religionists as toting machine guns and out to destroy the progress of the world and kick us back to medieval times. So you get very unsympathetic critiques of religion throughout, and they're very popular and notorious, and they will debate anyone, including all kinds of religionists. So if you want to enjoy that stuff, you can go ahead. And anybody who wants to talk about any of these in the context of a paper in this class, totally suitable. If you're familiar with any of these books or you're interested in them, very suitable. Maybe The Selfish Gene less so because it's not about God, but they're totally spot on for topics in this course. Whether you agree with them or not, you can talk about them in the paper. So the textbook makes a distinction between religious non-realists like Dennett, Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, but more classically Nietzsche and Freud, Feuerbach and Marx could be also added in there, and religious realists on the other hand. Now, the difference between these is a little bit complicated, but I want to focus on one thing. One main thing. The textbook authors do as well. So they say a lot of things, dance around it. But when it comes down to it, they're interested in one particular thing. And that is that line there about the content of religious assertions is ultimately ourselves. Or basically, more generally for the religious non-realists, that the content of religious beliefs and assertions, religious claims, is ultimately not what it seems. The religious claim might be about God or life after death or karma or my next lifetime or nirvana or anything like that. But the real meaning of this is to be interpreted in the way that Freud interprets your dreams. And he is a master of the dream interpretation. He knows what your dream means before you do. He knows what the words coming out your mouth mean. But you're unconscious of the motivations behind it, what you're saying, what it really means, the symbolic meaning. Freud makes this distinction between the manifest content, say, of a dream and the latent or symbolic hidden content, which you need an interpretation, a hermeneutics to discover. Okay, and so the religious non-realists are saying, what are all these people religious for? They believe this crazy stuff. What are they? Oh, it must be that they're talking about themselves in some way, the fear of death or something like that. So they reinterpret the meaning of religious assertions. Whereas the religious realists wants to say, no, look, at least some of the time when I'm talking about God, I'm talking about God. When I'm talking about life after death, I'm really talking about life after death. And my beliefs aren't to be reinterpreted. So the realist versus non-realism is about the content of religious beliefs. It's closely related to the idea of literalism. That is, should a statement be interpreted literally as just what it says, or symbolically, metaphorically, figuratively? Okay, but that's really a separate question, because a religious realist could say, oh, this passage is literal, but this passage is figurative. Of course, we use figures of speech all the time in order to express our relationship with the God or the nature of God or these sorts of things. So we have a right to figurative language. But when it comes right down to it, when we're stating our beliefs properly, we don't want Freud to come along and say it's really some unconscious thing we're not even aware of. That's what the real meaning of our belief is. Our nostalgia for the womb, he's saying, that's what it is. Or Marx is saying it's my alienation from the productive forces of society or something. That's not a very good statement of Marx right now, but it's my religious belief is an expression of my opiate dream. You don't take literally what someone on some opiate dream is saying, so you don't take literally what religious people are saying. They're just getting their weekly religious fix. That's the way to be a non-realist. If you're going to be a non-realist about religion, then you have to say what they're talking about, even when they mean to be talking straight, is not to be taken in a straight way. Whereas religious realists are putting their foot down and saying, no, at least sometimes we're talking real. We're talking literally, and we should be interpreted literally. We want to be interpreted literally. Now, that's complicated also by the idea that sometimes it's hard to express the nature of God or to talk about things transcendent. So you can be a realist and have real problems with what you're asserting as being distinct from what you believe, that they come apart, language and belief. So they're quite different things, and it's not about literalism or non-literalism. Except that the non-religious realists are forced to take things quite non-literally. Or actually, you know what they often do? They also take things literally that are intended symbolically. Like the old Vedas and stuff like that. Often they have symbolic meanings, but in the first translations, they come across as just fear of nature and fear of the God forces and so on. Our textbook wants to take a realist approach to religion, as opposed to a non-realist. So they'll give space to non-realists. You'll see throughout, they keep giving space because they're prominent philosophers, these people, and so they need their due. They deserve their space in a textbook like this. But you should know that the textbook authors are not really ultimately sympathetic to those ways of reinterpreting their belief. They want to hang on to belief. And because of that, they make a distinction, which I think is a little bit problematic, between ontological religious non-realists and methodological religious non-realists. Now the thing is, there's already a problem calling it religious non-realist. I'll get to that in a minute. And here the ontological, methodological, this distinction, those words are not really that helpful. Ontological non-realist. It doesn't really help a lot to say that. But this is the summary of it. This view, whatever you call it, they don't want to take religious language literally. They always have to reinterpret it. And sometimes it's based on some principle stance about linguistic meaning, about the problem of expressing religious beliefs. So Russell is a linguistic philosopher, Wittgenstein a linguistic philosopher, and when you change your views about language, what is being said even changes. And that sometimes pushes people in a non-realist direction. Whether Wittgenstein is really a non-realist is a big question, but certainly many of his followers are. So the ontological non-realist, that's basically saying is that they just aren't taking religious claims literally or very seriously. They need to be reinterpreted. Okay, now the methodological religion, again, let's forget about the name. They're trying to be more open. They're trying to be agnostic about the truth of religious assertions, but they want to say we should use all the tools of social sciences to study religion, and those approaches to studying religion are non-realist. When you use history or psychology or sociology to study a religion, you don't believe everything that they say in that religion. You don't believe a thing of it. But you take it seriously and you try to understand the social functions, the psychological functions of their beliefs, why they believe it, the economic implications of their beliefs. You try to understand that stuff neutrally. So there's a kind of neutrality with this methodological sort of non-realist that the textbook is talking about. And that neutrality they value. So they want that, but they don't want to have to give in to the serious skepticism and especially that kind of linguistic robbing, this philosophical robbing of the meaning of religious language by reinterpreting it based on some linguistic or philosophical principles. Not sure Wittgenstein's really doing that, but certainly Russell in the video that we'll look at, and others are, many of the others who I mentioned in the earlier slide. Basically, the ontological religious non-realists, they're really non-realists, they're non-believers. And these methodological types, they might be believers or might not be believers. They recognize the values of neutrality in study. Freud. We talked about Freud in the past, so here are just a few of the statements. I'll have you just go over them on your own. I did talk about them in class. I need to move on. And Durkheim is also a non-realist, a sociologist. The textbook gives Durkheim as an example of an ontological non-realist. So the difference between Freud and Durkheim has to do with whether that content of religious beliefs is understood to have essentially a reference to the psyche, the depth of the psyche, or the content of religious beliefs is reinterpreted to have a reference to the social order. Religion has a social dimension and it has a psychological dimension. So which is right? Can they both be right? But how are they to be integrated? When you look at the underlying principles, they're kind of at loggerheads. Freud is more of a social thinker than you think, but what he says is that the social institution is in your mind. Like your conscience, for example, is a social institution in your mind. Freud says that. Whereas Durkheim, when he's talking about social institutions, he's certainly talking about things that are not just in your mind. They're maybe spread across everyone's mind in some sense, in some kind of uniformity. But it's not ultimately a depth psychological thing. Now, in particular, Freud will understand religious awe, for example, as a fear, and that'll be a fear of our non-existence, or it'll be some anxiety, basically. Whereas awe, as a sense of what is holy or sacred, on Durkheim's understanding, is to be derived from something being declared sacred, that which means separated, set apart, forbidden. You can't go into the holiest of holies. Only the special people can go into there. Okay, so that setting up of those social rules, that was what establishes the sacred. By setting it apart socially, it becomes a reality for us psychologically. But the cause is sociological. So religion then becomes much more like a form of custom or morality. And interestingly, there's a third example of the so-called ontological non-realists about religion, Julian Huxley. And his idea is that religion evolved. So Huxley's famous Huxley family, his great-grandfather, I believe, would be Thomas Henry Huxley, was Darwin's bulldog, defended Darwinian evolution against Bishop Wilberforce and other religious figures. Whereas Darwin was kind of retiring, Thomas Henry Huxley was out there fighting the good cause, and very publicly. He was the Richard Dawkins of his day. Anyway, this is Julian Huxley, 20th century figure. So for Huxley, religion is a way of life that comes about because of our holding certain things in reverence, for our feeling and believing things to be sacred. So that's not necessarily different from Durkheim or some of the other earlier thinkers as well. But in this primitive social conditions, we had fears of nature, and we personified those fears to deal with our fears and created rituals to appease them and That's how religion started, by personification of natural forces. So that's also not by any stretch of the imagination a new idea. And it's not necessary to be taken literally, but that's what he's saying. And then, as society evolved and got more sophisticated, monotheism came in. So on this view, monotheism is the more sophisticated view that comes later after the primitive. On some views, we have monotheism actually arising first and then falling away. And then polytheism arises, a primitive form. And then monotheism comes back in with a triumph and a flourish. As an advance over polytheism. Now, that too, not that surprising, not that new. Even this next step, not that surprising or new, that says, well, but then science comes in and replaces religion, and science is more sophisticated. It's replacing the errors of religion and all this belief and superstition and the supernatural. However, we still have these evolved needs, these emotional needs that are primitive. They're still with us. They need to be met in some way. And we now know with science that religion has been meeting them with falsehoods. So what we need to do is fuse together the two. We need a scientific religion in some way that will appeal to our reason, or at least not violate principles of logic and contradict the known facts, but will nevertheless satisfy our emotional needs, if this is possible. So he's hoping to evolve to this in the future. So ultimately, he says religion must become naturalist. Religion and science must merge in some way. All right, so much for the ontological knowledge, the kinds of criticisms. They'll come up in other chapters again and again in more detail, and it's very natural for any one of those non-realists, those skeptics of religion, critics of religion, to come up in your papers, in what you're writing about, to anything that you find of interest. You can ask about it and I can maybe help you to find something. I don't want people to have to go widely in their research, but you need to identify for papers specific ideas that you're going to write about, and I'll be making more suggestions for you shortly. Now, with regard to non-realism, there's a few more complexities that need to be looked at. And these are really quite difficult, technical, but I'm going to try to avoid the overt conflicts with the textbook. The textbook talks about Buddhist non-realism, and that's kind of funny because that would be religious non-realism of a different sense. That would be non-realists who are really religious. They're not just non-realists about religion, they're religionists. But what they're non-realist about is certain claims about the world. The Buddha, in many senses, does not seem to be making claims about the external world. In the early text, there's evidence to suggest he's not really talking about the external world. Things like grass and wood, he says. He's talking about what happens within the framework of the mind-body. So when people come to him with questions about metaphysical questions about the cause of all things, the first cause, what happens after you die, and so on, he says, look, these questions are unproductive. It's mentioned in a little bit more detail in the textbook, but just for now, someone comes to the Buddha and says, you haven't explained these basic metaphysical questions, what happens after life, and whether the universe is eternal, whether the universe is infinite. You haven't talked about these things at all. You haven't explained them. So unless you start explaining these things, I'm out of here. I'm quitting this. And the Buddha says, well, look, did I ever say I was going to explain those things? Did I ever say, come to me, I'll explain all those things? I never promised that I would explain those things to you. What did I say I'd promised? I said I'd teach these things. These are the things I'm teaching. To come to me and demand that I answer those questions when I never promised is a little bit like someone hit with a poison arrow coming to a doctor and saying, take out this poison arrow or I'll die. But before you do, you have to first tell me who shot this arrow. What is the nature of this arrowhead? And this poison, what is the chemical nature of this poison? All this must be explained for me before you take this arrow out. He said, such a person would surely die. The point is that too much metaphysics is not going to help. Now, does that mean that he's an anti-realist about those things, or he doesn't think they're productive? Does he have an eternal existence? He doesn't say he does. He doesn't say he doesn't. He says the question is unfit. That's a bit of evidence that maybe the Buddha is not a realist. Here, the question is shifted slightly to a question of the realism about the external world. Is the world what it seems. That's the non-realism question when it comes to Buddhism. For example, there's a famous distinction that comes up quite early on in Buddhism, the distinction between levels of truth. The relative level of truth, that's everyday objects and persons. And some of the Buddhist texts are written like this, are written at this relative level. The Buddha walked over here and did this and talked to these people and said these things, and these things happen. But then there's another register, as it were, the absolute level, where mention of objects and persons does not occur, but only things that arise and pass away, and their conditionality, how if one arises, another will arise. If one does not arise, another will not arise. So the doctrine of the Buddha is put in that kind of language. It's not about me and you or God or anything like that. And this is the true doctrine. It's the secret doctrine. That's the higher doctrine, the Abhidhamma. So what does the Buddha really think about the relative level? The truth cannot be expressed there. The absolute truth cannot be expressed at the relative level. So everyday objects and persons, they seem to exist, but they're not what they seem. The self does not exist. There's no eternal self. This is a Buddhist doctrine. Example of this, we talk about the self at the relative level, fine. But at the absolute level, there's no such thing. When we see the reality as it is, we see there's no such thing as a self. What we do see, that there's a heap of things, an aggregate of things, which arise in conjunction with each other in conditional relations with each other. Those five things together form what we call the self at a relative level, but it's like the chariot has all these parts. There isn't something that is the chariot over and apart from all the connected chariot parts. The chariot just is all those parts connected in that way. The chariot isn't something extra. So you too are your mind and your body essentially combined in a certain way, although the mind is understood in a complex way. Now, when it comes to the absolute level, like, does the Buddha really exist after he dies? Here the Buddha again says, and this suggests some kind of philosophical idealism or non-realism, at least, he says the question is not fit. It's not a fit question. You can't say that the Tathagata exists after death. That's the name for the Buddha. You can't say that the Tathagata exists after death. You can't deny Tathagata exists after death. You can't both affirm and deny that the Tathagata exists after death. And you can't say it's neither the case that the Tathagata exists after death nor that he does not exist after death. You can't say any four. The fourfold negation. So this really does a number on logic and language, and it's not clear what survives from all that, but certainly it looks like a kind of non-realism. Now, even that is questionable. J. Garfield, a leading Buddhist scholar, says Nagarjuna's use of this fourfold negation, Nagarjuna is a great Buddhist philosopher, perhaps the greatest one after the Buddha, although many would have a claim to that title. J. Garfield interprets Nagarjuna as realist. But what's happened here is we've changed the whole question to whether philosophical realism or idealism is true. The question that the textbook is bringing up between these religious non-realists and religious realists, it's ill-formed, that way of putting things. You might put it another way, every religionist is a realist about what they believe. And the Buddhists are realist about the absolute level of what they state. They're not realist about the relative level. So the textbook takes a religious realist perspective. What does that mean? This lays it out a little bit, what religious realism means for them. That is to say, certainly you can talk about the origins of rituals and symbols, and much of that is human in its creation. And religion does serve psychological and social function. That they can allow, but what they will not allow is that the content, the meaning, and the reference, the things you're talking about of religious belief, they won't say that that must remain within the human, the social or the individual mind. They want the content, meaning, and reference of religious language to be able to transcend the human. That's what they're calling realist. It's a claim about language. It's a claim about the meaning of language. and not necessarily all religious language, but some at least. Their whole point is then you must not confuse the origin or the function of words and belief systems with the content of those beliefs and what they refer to. What they refer to as part of the content. You can't collapse those. The non-realist wants to collapse those. Our textbook doesn't want to collapse those. And I think that's actually right. You shouldn't do that. You can argue that there is no God to refer to or something like that. But anyway, my opinion doesn't really matter. But I think they make a good point in this way. I don't really like it being called religious realism for reasons that will come up soon. There's another difficulty about Wittgenstein when it comes to non-realism. So the Buddhists are called non-realist, and that's a little bit problematic. And also Wittgenstein is called non-realist, and that's a little bit problematic. I have provided you with some stuff about what Wittgenstein says about religion for you to judge for yourself. So read over the Wittgenstein, ask if you think he's a realist or not. I don't think they're crazy in calling him a non-realist. Some parts of that do suggest that, but he's also a realist about certain kinds of things, or the case can be made. When it comes to Wittgenstein, here are some points to keep in mind. This is a difficult subject. It's a whole other question, philosophy of language. It's really a different discipline entirely, so it's very difficult to jump ship like this, but I'll give it a try. Wittgenstein criticizes philosophers for approaching language in a very narrow way, almost exclusively with concerns about reference or denotation and truth. That is, trying to picture the world the way that it is. They think that the main function of language, if you ask philosophers, the only function of language is to depict reality in language some way, to capture it and to say what exists and to qualify it or predicate it in the correct way. And certainly we do that with language. But Wittgenstein's point is that when you look at how language is used, you see that, first of all, even the kinds of sentences that you have, there are many kinds: questions, exclamatory sentences, imperatives. These do things with words that aren't just asserting propositions. So there's more to do with language than simply represent the world. Often, even when we're talking to each other, the representational aspect is less important than other aspects, so that if we don't get it correct exactly, it doesn't matter. We can still get the job done. People correct for us as they understand. An example that Wittgenstein gives of this, a famous example, is a game. The word game. Now, even a child knows what a game is. You've known what games are since you were very young. There's no difficulty with the question of game. Everybody can recognize a game when they see one. You don't have to explain what a game is. And Wittgenstein's point is that's a good thing, because it might be very hard to actually define it, especially in the way that philosophers like definitions. Philosophers don't rely on dictionaries. You can find many definitions of the word game in a dictionary. But again, it's like that definition of the word philosophy as love of wisdom, or religion as linking back. It doesn't really tell you what religion is about or philosophy is about. The dictionary definition does not really tell you what the essence of a game is. The essence of a game would be some characteristics that all games have and only games have. It's something that unites all games together, common to all the games, but only common to them. So the textbook talks about a common core of religious experience. Is there a common core of religious experience? Here I'm talking the same question about game. Is there a common core of all games? So every game and only games, something that is the essence of games. That when an activity has this, it's a game, and any game has this
set of conditions.
That sort of definition, that's what philosophers have been looking for. That's the seeking for an essence. When they try to define anything explicitly, traditionally, that's what they're trying to do. So there's even an attempt to define God in that way, to say what the essence of God is in the so-called ontological argument, the first one that starts chapter 5. It's taking definition serious, not the casual use of definition. Hey, what's your definition of this? What's your definition? My definition of this. So though there we're talking about something that could be called conception. My conception of God, say, is different than your conception of God. But if I'm, say, a Muslim and you're a Christian, we actually have the same God. Maybe our conceptions of God are different, but we're talking about the same thing. At least we intend to be. Definition in philosophy is not mere conception like that. We're trying to say the essence, what every game would have to be. So anyone who recognizes games would have to know this essence. And if you don't know what a game is, it's because you don't know what this essence is. Wittgenstein's point is that it doesn't work like that. You can't ask kids to define games. They don't know how to define games. Nobody can give a philosophical definition of game like that. Necessary conditions of all games, sufficient condition of all games. There are too many kinds of games that you play by yourself, that the rules change along. If you're thinking about board games and football games, what is in common? Bouncing a ball against a wall is a game. Hopscotch. There are rules, there may not be rules, even as there are rules for bouncing a ball against the wall. The point then is that we all know what game is, but we cannot define it. Maybe the job of philosophy isn't strictly to articulate beliefs and concepts and definitions. Maybe that whole enterprise is a crazy thing to do because it's hopeless. It's like trying to define a game when you already know what it is. So the idea is that we have to look at how people use the word game, and that's much more revealing. In all walks of life, in all different contexts, the word game gets used, and it gets used very well. So if we look at that, you get some insight into games, and you see that they don't all form one, but there are overlapping sets of similarities that he called family resemblances. So when you talk about religious experience, we'll see in chapter 3, there's a question, is there one common core of religious experience? All religious experience, say all mystical experience is all the same, whether it's Hindu or Christian or anything like that. Or is it the case that there's a family resemblances, that there's some similarities in this dimension, but that dimension is not even present in these other examples? Like rules. Some games have rules, some games don't. So this is part of what Wittgenstein has done, is opened up our investigation into things by looking at how language is used. What came out of that was this slavish movement of Oxford philosophy, which was moribund before it started and dust covered before it began. And that was that language is already perfectly fine the way it is in some sense. We can't criticize language. It's the basis. Ordinary language school said that there's no point in changing the way people speak, but that's quite a different thing. And Wittgenstein is quite critical of what people say and how they talk about, and certainly about what philosophers say. In fact, he's more critical of philosophers and what they say and how they talk about. So the huge implications for philosophy, if these traditional philosophical definitions, so-called essential definitions, are not really possible, that there's nothing in common. I've gone into this about games, but you can see I'm really talking about religious experience, which is the topic of chapter 3. If there are no essential kinds, then there are no distinct boundaries around reference sets. That is, the groups of things that we're talking about, games, say, are not all the same. And then there's no distinct boundaries between them. Just like after Darwin, there really aren't distinct boundaries between species, at least not in time, because one slowly evolves from another. All species are like branches on an evolutionary tree. They're part of something larger. So nature has no firm joints. The firm joints are what are declared in language and movable with culture, movable with a form of life. This is what Wittgenstein suggests. You can state that by saying meaning is use. Words play roles in language games like pieces on a chessboard or tokens in a board game. The meaning of the token is the use of the token in the game. The meaning of a word is the use of the word in actual life. So this opens up the whole history of the word, how the word was used in the past. The meaning might be different. So the meaning is in the use, it's in the permitted moves and in the unexpected violations of the moves that govern the word. So this is what he means by grammar. It's a very broad sense of grammar. It's not just your rules that you learned in grade 9. Normally when you say what's the meaning of this word, you think, oh, it's a picture that comes up in my mind, or it's the idea that comes up in my mind as soon as you say the word. Wittgenstein says, no, no. The idea that comes up in your mind is not the meaning of the word. The meaning of the word is already established before you ever learned it. It's established in the patterns and the uses of the words. Now, that's not to say that you can't start using the word in different and innovative ways, that you can, it's like you're bouncing a ball against the wall. What are the rules? The rules have been this, but now we can start doing something else. The problem for Wittgenstein is when philosophers just barge in and start imposing rules and not looking at how words are actually used and the deep meanings that are already there. They end up breaking things, finding problems that don't even exist. Philosophical problems are created by philosophers. They're not really there, many of them. It's a little bit like like what the Buddha was saying. Not quite, but it's comparable in an interesting way. So the key thing, if you say meaning is use, it's a nice little slogan, but what does it mean? The point is that use is in a shared social space. Meaning is not in your head. Meaning of words is not in your head. Meaning of words is a shared social thing. It exists spread out over history and over culture and over the history of language. So theology as grammar, the example is like, suppose two people are arguing, how many arms does God have? And one says, no, 4. And I said, no, God only has 2. And then someone comes up and says, look, you guys don't know what you're talking about. The question of arms, how many arms God has, that's wrong. There's not an answer to this question. That's the kind of thing that's saying, like, you haven't understood how we use the word God. You're trying to predicate God, say things of God, like we say things of ordinary things, that you've missed the role for God. When I say, oh, good God, perhaps it may be some genuine relationship with God, if I'm a believer and I say that. But by looking at it, you see the emotionality, what's going on, the context in which I've said that, that is what tells us much more about God than any strict definition. So we don't use the word grammar like that. It actually would be more like pragmatics. Grammar here includes the social context, or what Wittgenstein called the form of life. Grammar includes that. All right, so I'm going on. Now, here's where I deal with this ambiguity. Religious non-realism. I just don't like this phrase. They walked right into a problem. Why did they do that? What is religious? The non-realism? No, it's a non-realism about religion. That's what they're really talking about. They want to know whether you can be realist about religion or whether you have to be non-realist about religion. And our authors are especially interested in a particular religion, but they're open-minded enough to want to talk about all religions. So I think if you unpack the ambiguity of religious non-realism, you can either mean non-realism about religion, and I think that's kind of what their methodological non-realism is about, or you can be non-realist and religious. And that's a very peculiar kind of combination, a religious non-realist, unless you mean something like what the Buddha was saying or Wittgenstein. But I think that's bringing in a second sense of non-realism. So here is a better way to make this, and rather this is confusing to try to work it out like this. So instead, we make a set of distinctions. Let's distinguish not just religious and non-religious, but religious and anti-religious. And religious here, for a moment, I'm just going to say adhering preferentially to one religious. So I'm open-minded, everyone can have their religion, but I'm a Christian, say, okay? Or I'm a Muslim, there are these other religions, I may respect them, but this is the one I believe, okay? A non-religious person does not preferentially adhere to one religion, and the anti-religious is against all religion. So in addition to that, let's now talk about realism versus non-realism about religion and religious claims. So this is the key thing that the textbook wants to be talking about, realism versus non-realism about religious claims. Then there are two kinds. And this is my distinction here. The strong non-realists reject the truth or meaningfulness of any religious claims. So this is like your Freud, Nietzsche, Feuerbach, Marx, Dawkins, all those others that we talked about. They reject the truth or the meaningfulness of these views altogether. Then there's the weak non-realists. They say, well, religious claims are meaningful, but they're disguised. That is, you have to interpret them in some way, You see, because they're disguised, they need some interpretation, they need some hermeneutics, and the person with the right hermeneutics is going to be more advanced and more sophisticated than the person who has the religious beliefs. Now, I would like to introduce a further distinction amongst realists. I just distinguished two non-realists. Now, there are two kinds of realists. A traditional realist thinks the key religious claims in their tradition are true, and that contradictory traditions cannot also be true. So it puts an edge on that preferential adherence. Our traditions are true. This, I think, is very much like what some of the authors want. They say, look, when I'm talking about a Christian God and Jesus being God, I'm talking about that guy back there, Jesus. And I'm not talking about some fantasy of before I was born and when I wanted to be back in the womb, or fear of the Father or something. But a traditional realist is one thing, but I think that there's some tension between a traditional realist and this being open to other religions, especially the contradictory ones, because ultimately you have to say they can't quite be true. So if you want to be open, truly open to all of them, and not be a non-realist to debunk all religious claims, then I think you're driven to a position that I would call pluralist realism about religion. So you think that key religious claims, not all religious claims, but key religious claims in many traditions, maybe not all, are true, despite the apparent and maybe even actual contradictions amongst them. Maybe key doctrines of Buddhism, and perhaps the key doctrines of Christianity, say, are all true, and that they're mutually inconsistent. But you can have two different systems of truth like that. That would be pluralist realism. And the textbook doesn't talk about that at all. But I think that you can find room for pluralist realism whenever they talk about Buddhism and Wittgenstein. That's what I think. So I think there's an argument to be made there. Or you can argue against my position. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up a paper topic where you guys argue against pluralist realism. I'm going to define my position a little bit as a target, and you guys can go after it based on your traditions. So, to summarize, we should call the anti-religionists anti-religionists, not just religious non-realists. Come on. They're anti-religious non-realists is what they are. And if you're religious, you're probably a realist about some religious claims, probably your own. And if you're anti-religious, you're going to be non-realist about all religious claims. But if you're non-religious, but still kind of open to being religious, then you're open to being religious, open to adhering to one rather than another religion. Now, the real question, I think, is can a non-realist about all religious claims be religious or even open to religion? A harder question is whether pluralist realism about religion is possible. How many religions can be believed in as legitimate given the diversity of their worldviews? That is, the diversity and the incoherence, the inconsistency. If you've got different religious systems and they're inconsistent with each other, ultimately, do you have to say one of them's got to be true, the other one not? Or do you have to say, no, these are incommensurable but equivalent and equipolant ways of looking at the world, both equally true? That's not saying anything goes or any truth that they make in any one tradition is going to be true in that tradition. There's a criteria of true or false within each tradition. All right. All right, that then is my lecture about philosophy and the nature of philosophy and the relation of philosophy to religion. I hope you enjoyed it. It was hell making it.